All countries in the world are burdened with debt. The United States' debt has surpassed $38 trillion, the highest amount ever recorded. The European Union has approximately $14 trillion in debt, while Japan has nearly $9 trillion. Oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia and export giants like Germany and China have also accumulated large amounts of debt. However, the contradiction that arises here is the main question. If everyone is in debt, then who is the creditor? This is a ground where financial historians, money, power, and history collide. And situations are never as simple as they seem. Debt is more than just a burden. It forms the cornerstones of today's world. Every conflict, every crisis, every rise and fall is built upon these invisible debt records and IAs. If you investigate the chain of creditors thoroughly, you will reach a disturbing truth. The world is actually in debt to no one. It is in debt to itself. However, this does not mean that everyone benefits equally. To understand how this planet, drowning in debt exceeding $315 trillion, which is equivalent to almost 3 times the global economy, reached this point, we need to go back to the past. Centuries before the first credit card transactions or digital money transfers, the concept of national debt emerged not on Wall Street, but on the battlefield. In 1694, England was in conflict with France, and its gold reserves were decreasing. The king contacted merchants to get support. The merchants provided financial aid to the kingdom in exchange for a continuous flow of interest based on future taxes. The Bank of England was established to manage this new system. This was a major innovation. Now the state had the opportunity to spend money that did not exist. In return, the lenders gained something valuable, a document guaranteed by the state and tradable. Thus, the emergence of the government bond, the foundation of the modern financial system, occurred. France took this as an example. The Netherlands developed it further. The newly independent United States adopted this method to finance its revolution and subsequent westward expansion. National debt became a sign of reliability, not a sign of failure. The capacity to borrow meant the ability to govern. While empires in the past conquered lands to obtain gold, today they issue bonds to earn interest. Battlefields have now become financial statements. 3 centuries later, debt became the most important export item worldwide. The United States' debt reaches $38 trillion. Japan has a debt of over $9 trillion. Global borrowing increases by $1 trillion every 100 days. Every nation is in a debtor position. All banks provide loans. Every individual is both a debtor and a creditor through taxes, savings, and pensions. But who is really at the other end of the rope? Anatomy of U.S. debt. Let's start with the United States, because debt exists not only at the national level but also on a global scale. About half of the total debt of $38 trillion is public debt owed to investors, not to other parts of the government. A large portion of these investors, about 2/3, are American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining third, an estimated $9 trillion, is foreign-owned. Japan is the largest creditor, with approximately $1 trillion, followed by China with approximately $800 billion, then England, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So, when people say that the U.S. owes China, it is partly true, but this is valid for only about 2% of the total. A large part of America's debt actually belongs to Americans. The Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy them. The Federal Reserve usually buys them back and creates new dollars in this process. Americans pay taxes that pay interest on these bonds, and these interests then flow back into American retirement accounts. This is a cyclical mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is mostly a reflection of the same system. The global chain, a potato game made of words, and this cycle is not unique to America. It is a global phenomenon. Japan provides financing to the U.S. through government bonds. The U.S. provides loans to Europe through the IMF. Europe provides loans to developing countries through the World Bank. Developing countries lend back to rich countries by depositing their foreign exchange reserves in Western bonds. This situation resembles a hot potato game made of words. Each country holds the commitments of another country in debt. Each commitment is secured by another commitment. This is like an example of a poker table where each player borrows chips from the next. And the only rule that ensures the continuation of the game is that no one has left the game area. However, there is an even stronger layer: the markets themselves. Behind every government bond lies a network of institutions. This network consists of hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks that manage tens of trillions of dollars in assets. They are the real decision makers in credit matters. They rule on which countries can borrow at low cost and which ones have to pay high interest to survive. When there is a loss of confidence, currencies lose value, governments can collapse, and entire economies can be restructured in an instant. Democracy decides who will rule. Markets decide who will survive. The ultimate market maker, the modern high priest of this system, is the central bank. Central banks not only manage debt, they produce it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys a government bond, it creates new money in return. A liability on one balance sheet becomes an asset on another. Every dollar in circulation represents a unit of debt elsewhere. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every banknote, every digital dollar carries an invisible debt commitment, IOU, on its surface. For decades, this cycle maintained itself through trust. As long as investors believe that governments will pay the interest even if they never pay the principal, the machine continues to turn. When trust collapses. But what happens when trust is damaged? We have seen an example before. In 2010, the government in Greece began to have difficulty paying its debt. Bondholders fell into great anxiety. Yields increased rapidly. The European Central Bank and the IMF stepped in, but aid packages were implemented along with austerity measures, tax increases, spending cuts, and mass unemployment. Defaults in Argentina turned debt into a national scourge. In Sri Lanka, when the government could not find foreign currency to pay its loans, fuel shortages and political collapse emerged. When the system collapses, creditors suddenly begin to appear. The IMF, credit rating agencies, anonymous bondholders squeezing all countries. Yet even after the collapse, the situation continues in the same way. New loans replace old ones. Old debts are restructured. The mechanism starts working again with a new name in the same tables. Because in the 21st century, the repayment of debt is not intended. It is designed to be rotated continuously. Today's governments do not really intend to pay their debts, neither now nor in the future. This is not a conspiracy. It is a matter of policy. When we or you take out a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. However, governments do not act this way. They evaluate paying their debts by issuing new bonds, a method economists call refinancing. Like rotating debt, interest becomes the most important product. It is the rent demanded for stability. The global economy has become dependent on this rent, like a shark that has to swim constantly. Today's global financial system is based on trust rather than repayment. Debt will never be paid. The United States will never reset its $38 trillion debt. It will continue to refinance constantly. Japan has been managing its debt exceeding 250% of its GDP for years, and despite this, government bond yields remain almost close to zero. Investors do not expect repayment. They just hope for the continuation of the agreement. Why? Because they accept government debt as the safest collateral. A U.S. Treasury bond is seen not as a liability, but as one of the cornerstones of global markets. The system is built on the fact that governments will never repay their debts, because if they do, the world will lose its most reliable financial instrument. If Washington decided to fully repay its debt, banks and funds worldwide would suddenly lose their most stable assets. The supply of the dollar would shrink abruptly, which would trigger deflation and economic collapse. Paying debts would eliminate one of the elements that ensures the functioning of the economy. Therefore, governments apply the exact opposite of this. They continue to issue more debt. This situation happens not randomly, but regularly. Debt is becoming a kind of heartbeat of capitalism. For this reason, when politicians talk about balancing the budget or repaying the national debt, they present an illusion. The aim is not to eliminate the debt completely. It is to keep it sustainable, manageable, and attractive enough for the system to never forget it. Because when faith is lost, numbers no longer matter. Trust is shaken, interest rates rise, and the economy based entirely on promises comes to a standstill. This is essentially the secret of sovereign debt. The plan is not to repay it, but to ensure that the world continues to believe in it. This is a closed cycle of trust, and as long as this trust lasts, the numbers can expand unlimitedly. Debt and inequality, however, trust distribution has not been made equally. The phrase, "we owe it to ourselves," is only partially true. Interest payments are not distributed equally in society. What we take from taxpayers and workers flows towards companies and investors who hold the debts. In other words, debt is not just a transfer between countries. There is a transfer between classes. This is what explains why global inequality and global indebtedness increase together. While the system rewards those who have debt, it punishes only those who pay debts. If this situation sounds familiar to you, the reason is the same story that continues from households to nations, from nations to the planet. Creditors are not bad characters. Debtors are not victims either. Both are different aspects of the same engine. The problem arises when the engine's fuel runs out, when new borrowings cannot meet previous commitments. At this point, the question, "Who is the creditor?" ceases to be abstract and becomes more personal, because there is no single figure to blame within this global structure. Neither China, nor Wall Street, nor the IMF. We are all in question, that is, us. The modern financial system has turned debt into money. Governments work on this. Banks increase this. Investors trade, and citizens depend on this. The distinction between debtor and creditor has become increasingly blurred. While debt once meant bondage, today it expresses balance. However, if this balance is broken one day, if trust is shaken, this illusion ends, and we remember what debt really means. A promise we cannot keep forever.